My ex-husband, Mark, and my younger sister, Chloe, are currently standing beneath the blinding, heat-radiating studio lights of the New York Stock Exchange. They are about to ring the opening bell to launch Apex Capital, a quantitative hedge fund entirely powered by the predictive artificial intelligence they stole from me. The financial press is practically hyperventilating, calling it the most anticipated public offering in modern Wall Street history. Apex is debuting with a staggering valuation of $10 billion. Watching them on the live television feed, I have to admit they look absolutely flawless. Mark is wearing a bespoke navy blue suit that perfectly highlights his broad shoulders, his brilliant, camera-ready smile plastered across his handsome face. Chloe is standing right beside him, wearing a sleek, white designer dress, her arm linked affectionately and possessively through his. They are the golden couple of high finance. They look invincible. But they don't know that exactly 3 years ago, before they systematically destroyed my life, I buried a moral alignment protocol deep inside the neural network of the AI. It is a digital dead man switch that requires a manual, cryptographic handshake from my personal terminal every 365 days. If that highly specific alphanumeric handshake isn't received, the artificial intelligence assumes it has been compromised by hostile actors. But it doesn't just shut down. A shutdown would trigger standard error alarms, allowing their engineers to unplug the servers and save their capital. Instead, the AI quietly inverts its core predictive logic. It takes its flawless ability to forecast global markets and instantly weaponizes it. It will begin executing high-frequency trades in the exact opposite direction of profitability. It will buy at the absolute peak, and it will aggressively short sell at the absolute bottom, liquidating assets at the speed of light. Today is day 365. My phone is vibrating violently against the cheap, peeling laminate desk of my tiny, freezing one-bedroom apartment in Brooklyn. The caller ID flashes. Mark. I'm not going to answer it. I'm entirely too busy leveraging my entire net worth into put options, betting heavily that Apex Capital is about to experience the most catastrophic financial collapse of the century. To understand how I ended up in a dingy apartment, calmly waiting to obliterate the two people I once loved more than anything in the world, you have to understand how perfectly, blissfully happy I used to be. 4 years ago, my life was a masterpiece of quiet, domestic joy. I was 32 years old, deeply in love, and living in a beautiful, sunlit brownstone in Park Slope. Mark and I had been married for 5 wonderful years. Back then, he wasn't a ruthless, billionaire hedge fund titan. He was a mid-level financial analyst at a boring, traditional bank. He was sweet, incredibly supportive, and grounded. He would wake up early just to grind fresh coffee beans so the smell would wake me up, leaving little sticky notes on my computer monitors telling me how proud he was of me. I truly believed, down to my very marrow, that I was the luckiest woman alive. And then there was Chloe. Chloe was my little sister, my best friend, and a fiercely ambitious corporate lawyer. She was practically a third member of our marriage. She was always over at our house, drinking our expensive wine, laughing loudly at Mark's terrible jokes, and celebrating every small victory we had. We were a tight-knit trio. I trusted them with my absolute soul. I had no idea that the warmth I felt from them was just the heat of a fire they were building to burn me alive. At the time, I wasn't interested in money or Wall Street. I was a senior data scientist and software engineer at a nonprofit tech firm, and I spent my evenings and weekends endlessly coding a massive passion project. I called it Project Delphi. Delphi was an artificial intelligence designed to predict global supply chain disruptions. I wanted to build a tool for international aid organizations. The neural network scraped billions of data points in real time, satellite weather imagery, geopolitical news feeds, obscure shipping manifests, local crop yields, and labor strikes, to forecast exactly when and where a famine, a medicine shortage, or a logistical bottleneck would occur. It was designed to save lives by telling NGOs where to send resources weeks before a crisis even happened. It took me 3 grueling years to perfect the algorithm. It was beautiful. It was a digital oracle, capable of seeing the invisible threads of cause and effect that connected the entire globe. The nightmare began on a rainy Tuesday evening in late October. I was sitting at my desk in our home office, the blue glow of 3 monitors reflecting in the dark, rain-streaked window. Mark walked into the room, carrying 2 steaming mugs of Earl Grey tea. He leaned over my shoulder, pressing a soft kiss to the top of my head, his eyes naturally drifting to the cascading data on the center screen. "What is it looking at tonight, Alara?" he asked, his voice soft and tired from his own long day at the bank. "Copper," I replied, pointing to a complex graph that was projecting a massive, sudden downward spike in global availability. Delphi is analyzing a localized labor dispute at a mine in Chile, a weird monsoon pattern forming over a major shipping port in Southeast Asia, and a quiet regulatory change regarding export taxes in China. It's predicting a severe global copper shortage in exactly 14 days. The supply chain is going to completely freeze. Mark went entirely still. The warmth of his body pressed against the back of my chair seemed to suddenly chill. He didn't say anything for a long time. He didn't see a tool to warn the world. He didn't see an early warning system to stabilize the manufacturing economy. He saw the future. And on Wall Street, having absolute certainty about the future is the only thing that matters. 14 days? Mark asked, his voice suddenly tight, the casual warmth completely gone. Are you absolutely sure about that math? Delphi has a 99.8% confidence interval, I said proudly, taking a sip of the tea he had brought me. It's never been wrong during the historical backtesting. The code is airtight. Why? Mark didn't answer right away. He just stared at the screen, a strange, predatory light illuminating his dark eyes. He stared at the data as if he were looking at a winning lottery ticket. He finally blinked, kissed my cheek mechanically, told me he had some work emails to catch up on, and quickly left the room. I didn't know it then, as I smiled and went back to my coding, but he immediately went into the guest bedroom and called Chloe. That was the exact moment his ambition metastasized into pure greed. That was the moment my husband and my sister decided that my life was an acceptable price to pay for an empire. Exactly 14 days after Delphi predicted the global copper shortage, the world caught up to my machine. I was sitting in our sunlit kitchen, drinking my morning coffee and scrolling through the news on my tablet. The headlines were frantic. A massive, unprecedented strike had paralyzed the Chilean mining sector overnight. Simultaneously, a freak super typhoon had grounded cargo ships across the Pacific, and Beijing had unexpectedly halted all raw metal exports. The spot price of copper didn't just rise, it violently exploded, jumping 22% in a matter of hours. Manufacturing sectors from electronics to automotive went into a sheer panic. I stared at the screen, my heart hammering against my ribs, but not out of fear. I felt a profound, overwhelming sense of awe. Delphi had been right. It hadn't just guessed, it had calculated the exact trajectory of human chaos with flawless precision. I immediately started drafting an email to a contact at the World Economic Forum, practically vibrating with the realization of how many supply chain crises we could prevent, how many aid shipments we could optimize. That evening, Mark came home from the bank carrying a bottle of Dom Perignon. He was practically buzzing, a manic, electric energy rolling off him. He spun me around the kitchen, popping the cork and pouring the champagne until it spilled over the rims of the crystal flutes. To Delphi, he toasted, his eyes dark and wide, completely entirely fixed on me. To the most brilliant woman in the world. I blushed, drinking the champagne, feeling a deep, radiating warmth in my chest. I thought he was celebrating my philanthropic breakthrough. I thought he was proud of the lives my code was going to save. I was so beautifully, tragically naive. I didn't realize that earlier that morning, Mark had closed a highly leveraged short position on copper-dependent manufacturing stocks, utilizing an offshore brokerage account he had opened under a shell LLC. He hadn't made a breakthrough. He had made $4 million in a single afternoon. And he hadn't done it alone. Over the next few months, the atmosphere in our Park Slope brownstone began to subtly, imperceptibly shift. Chloe started coming over more frequently. My sister had always been a fixture in our lives, but her visits took on a new, intensely focused energy. She would arrive straight from her corporate law firm, still wearing her razor-sharp blazers and Louboutin heels, carrying thick leather briefcases instead of her usual bottles of cheap wine. She and Mark began retreating to the dining room or out to the back patio, speaking in low, hushed tones. Whenever I walked into the room to offer them food or a drink, the conversation would abruptly stop. They would look up, their faces perfectly blank, and suddenly pivot to talking about the weather or Chloe's boring corporate litigation cases. "What are you two always whispering about?" I asked one night, leaning against the doorframe and smiling at them. Chloe didn't miss a beat. She gave me her signature, brilliant smile, the one that won her juries and disarmed hostile witnesses. "Mark is just helping me untangle some ridiculous financial jargon for a merger I'm working on, Alara. You know I'm terrible with the quantitative stuff. Thank God I have a brother-in-law who speaks spreadsheet." Mark chuckled, wrapping an arm around my waist and kissing my temple. "Just trying to be a good family man." I bought it completely. Why wouldn't I? They were the two pillars of my existence. I was actually thrilled that my husband and my sister shared such a close, supportive bond. It made me feel incredibly secure. I had no idea that the merger they were discussing was the systematic dismantling of my life. Chloe, with her ruthless legal mind, was structuring the architecture of their theft. She was setting up a labyrinth of holding companies in Delaware and the Cayman Islands. They needed to move the millions Mark was making off my algorithm without triggering IRS audits or alerting my bank accounts. To keep the money flowing, Mark needed more predictions. He became intensely interested in my evening coding sessions. He would sit beside me, watching the glowing text scroll across the monitors, and casually ask for hypothetical scenarios. "Delphi is incredible, Alara," he said one evening, massaging my shoulders as I typed. "But how robust is it with microsectors? Like, say, lithium-ion battery supply chains in Eastern Europe? Could it predict a bottleneck there?" "Of course," I replied, leaning back into his hands, eager to show off my creation to the man I loved. I ran the parameters through the neural network. 10 minutes later, Delphi spit out a grim forecast. A localized power grid failure in a manufacturing hub, combined with a geopolitical tariff dispute, would slash production by 40% in 3 weeks. Mark kissed me deeply, his hands gripping my shoulders a little too tight. "You are a genius," he whispered. 3 weeks later, the lithium market crashed. Mark and Chloe made another $12 million. The adrenaline of the illicit wealth began to fundamentally change them. The shared secret, the intoxicating thrill of playing God with the global markets, acted as an aphrodisiac. The boundaries between them began to blur, melting under the heat of pure, unchecked greed. I started noticing the subtle physical changes, but my trusting mind always found a rationalization. Mark came home wearing a $20,000 Patek Philippe watch. He told me it was a massive end-of-year bonus from the bank. Chloe started carrying Hermes bags and casually mentioned she had paid off the rest of her law school loans. "I won a massive settlement," she claimed, not meeting my eyes. But the most glaring red flag was the one I ignored on a freezing night in January. I had woken up at 3 a.m, my throat dry. I padded downstairs in my socks to get a glass of water. The kitchen was dark, but a sliver of light spilled out from the slightly ajar door of the home office. I walked silently toward it, gently pushing the door open. Mark was sitting in my desk chair, the glow of Delphi's interface illuminating his face. Chloe was standing right beside him. She wasn't just looking at the screen, she was leaning entirely over him, her chest pressed against his shoulder, her hand resting intimately, possessively, on his thigh. They were staring at a new prediction, their breathing synchronized, their faces mere inches apart. The air in the room was thick. It felt heavy, charged with a dark, conspiratorial intimacy that made my stomach suddenly drop. "Mark?" I said softly. They sprang apart like they had been electrocuted. Chloe practically jumped back, her face flushing violently red, while Mark instantly minimized the Delphi window, his eyes wide and panicked. "Alara," Mark stammered, his usually smooth voice cracking. "We were just..." I couldn't sleep. Chloe came over to pick up some files she left, and I was just showing her the interface. "At 3 a.m? I asked, a cold knot tightening in my chest. Chloe stepped forward, offering a completely fabricated, sympathetic smile. "I'm so sorry for waking you, Elle. I was just stressed about a case and needed a distraction. The code is just, it's mesmerizing." I looked back and forth between them. The sheer panic in their eyes was undeniable, but my brain absolutely refused to process the reality of the situation. My husband and my sister. It was an impossibility. It was a nightmare my mind wouldn't allow me to wake up to. "Okay," I whispered, rubbing my tired eyes. "Just don't stay up too late." I went back upstairs, pulling the heavy duvet over my shoulders, desperately trying to shake off the cold feeling of dread. I convinced myself I was being paranoid. I convinced myself they loved me. I didn't know that downstairs, in the glow of my own monitors, they had just realized how close they had come to losing everything. They realized they couldn't risk sneaking around my home office anymore. It was time for them to take Delphi for themselves. And to do that, Chloe the corporate lawyer knew exactly what they had to do. They had to completely, legally, and mercilessly destroy me. The execution did not happen in the dark. It happened on a bright, perfectly ordinary Friday afternoon under the glaring fluorescent lights of a corporate conference room. I was sitting at my desk at the nonprofit, typing up a mundane data report for a clean water initiative, when an automated calendar invite popped up on my screen. It was from the board of directors, demanding an immediate, mandatory meeting in the glass-walled executive suite on the top floor. I didn't think much of it. I grabbed my tablet, smoothed down my skirt, and took the elevator up, assuming they wanted an update on my latest logistics software. I pushed open the heavy glass door. My boss wasn't there. The board members weren't there. Instead, sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table, was my husband. Mark was wearing a brand new, charcoal gray Tom Ford suit that cost more than my car. He was sitting perfectly still, his hands folded neatly in front of him. And standing right beside him, organizing a terrifyingly thick stack of legal briefs, was my sister. Chloe wore a severe black blazer, her hair pulled back into a tight, merciless bun. Flanking them were 2 older men in sharp suits whom I didn't recognize, but who practically reeked of expensive billable hours. The air in the room was freezing. All the oxygen seemed to instantly evaporate from my lungs. I stopped dead in the doorway, a nervous, confused laugh escaping my throat. "Mark? Chloe? What is going on? Why are you guys here?" Neither of them smiled. The warmth I had known for 5 years was entirely, chillingly absent. They looked at me not as a wife or a sister, but as a liability. As a bug in their system. "Have a seat, Alara," Chloe said. Her voice was clinical, devoid of any familial affection. It was her courtroom voice. The voice she used when she was about to destroy a hostile witness. I didn't move. My heart began to hammer a frantic rhythm against my ribs. "What is this? Where is the executive director?" "The director has recused himself," Chloe stated, tapping the stack of papers against the table to align the edges. "As of 9 o'clock this morning, the nonprofit's board of directors accepted a highly lucrative, anonymous donation of $5 million to fund their upcoming African agricultural initiatives. In exchange for that donation, the board signed a waiver transferring the rights of investigating a severe internal breach of contract to outside counsel. Specifically, to my firm." I stared at her, the words blurring together into a senseless hum. "A breach of contract? What are you talking about?" Mark finally spoke. He didn't look me in the eye. He looked at my chin. "We need to talk about Project Delphi, Alara." "Delphi is my personal project," I said, my voice trembling, defensive instinct kicking in. "I build it at home. On my own time. On my own hardware." "That is a lie," Chloe snapped, sliding a thick manila folder across the polished wood. It stopped right in front of me. Inside that folder are server logs, IP tracking data, and timestamped forensic audits. They definitively prove that you utilize this nonprofit's proprietary databases, their cloud computing resources, and their localized servers to train your artificial intelligence. You use donor-funded resources to build a private, for-profit algorithm. "No," I shouted, the sheer absurdity of the accusation breaking my paralysis. "That's completely fabricated. I never touched their servers. I bought my own processing units. You know that, Mark. You helped me carry the hardware up the stairs." Mark finally looked at me, and what I saw in his eyes broke my soul. There was no guilt. There was no remorse. There was only a cold, calculating emptiness. "The digital footprint says otherwise, Alara," Mark said smoothly. "The forensics are irrefutable. You embezzled corporate resources to build Delphi. Under federal law, that constitutes grand larceny, corporate espionage, and severe wire fraud. The board was prepared to call the FBI this morning. You are looking at 10 to 15 years in federal prison." The room started to spin. The walls felt like they were closing in. I gripped the back of a leather chair to keep my knees from buckling. My own sister had fabricated a digital paper trail to frame me for a federal crime. She had used her legal expertise not to protect me, but to build an inescapable cage. "Why?" I choked out, tears finally spilling hot and fast down my cheeks. I looked back and forth between the two people I loved most. Why are you doing this to me? Because you lack vision, Mark said, his voice hardening, revealing the monster he had been hiding beneath his sweet, supportive facade. You built a crystal ball, Alara. You built the most powerful financial weapon in human history, and you wanted to use it to track grain shipments for charities. It's pathetic. Delphi belongs on Wall Street. It belongs to someone who understands its true potential. Chloe stepped forward, placing a sleek black pen on top of the manila folder. Here is how this plays out, Alara, my sister said, looking at me with absolute, terrifying indifference. Mark has recently resigned from the bank. He is now the CEO of a newly formed entity called Apex Capital. Apex has purchased the right to pursue this intellectual property theft from the nonprofit. She tapped the pen. If you sign these documents, you formally transfer absolute, irrevocable ownership of the Delphi source code, all related patents, and the core architecture to Apex Capital. In exchange, Apex will decline to press criminal charges. You will sign a non-disclosure agreement. You will walk out of this building, and you will remain free. If you refuse to sign, my associates here will dial the authorities, and you will be arrested before you reach the lobby. I was hyperventilating. A panic attack was gripping my chest like a vice. I looked at Mark. My husband. The man I had promised to spend my life with. The man who made me coffee and left me sweet notes. Mark, please, I begged, my voice shattering into a pathetic sob. You're my husband. Please don't do this. Mark didn't flinch. He reached into his tailored suit jacket and pulled out a second, thinner envelope. He tossed it onto the table. It landed with a soft, dismissive thud next to the extortion papers. I'm not your husband anymore, Alara, he said. Those are divorce papers. I'm filing on the grounds of your criminal financial behavior. It's an at-fault filing, which protects my assets from the settlement. You get nothing. I looked at the envelope. Then, I looked at Chloe. She was standing slightly behind Mark, and in that agonizing, frozen moment, she reached out and rested her hand on his lower back. It was an intimate, familiar gesture. It was a gesture of ownership. The 3 a.m. meeting in the office. The whispered conversations. The sudden wealth. It all clicked together with a sickening, violent clarity. They hadn't just stolen my life's work. They had stolen my entire reality. They had been sleeping together, plotting together, laughing at my naive, trusting blindness for months. I was nothing to them but a stepping stone, a brief inconvenience on their path to a billion-dollar empire. I looked at the pen. I looked at the 2 federal crimes outlined in the fabricated audit. I had no money for a defense attorney. I had no leverage. They had meticulously engineered an absolute checkmate. My hands were shaking so violently I could barely grip the gold-plated pen. I didn't read the dense legalese. I didn't care anymore. My heart had already stopped beating. The rest of me was just catching up. I signed the IP transfer. I signed the brutal non-disclosure agreement. I signed the divorce papers, legally dissolving the greatest lie I had ever lived. Good choice, Chloe said quietly, pulling the documents away from me the second the ink dried. Security will escort you out of the building, Mark said, checking his $20,000 watch. Do not contact us again, Alara. We are done. I turned around. I didn't pack my desk. I didn't say goodbye to my colleagues. I walked out of the glass doors, stepped into the elevator, and descended to the street level. I walked out into the freezing New York rain with absolutely nothing. I had no husband, no sister, no job, and my masterpiece had been stolen. I was dead. But as I stood shivering in the rain, staring up at the gray sky, a tiny, microscopic spark ignited deep in the absolute void of my chest. They thought I was just a naive coder. They forgot that I was the Oracle. And the Oracle always, inevitably, has the last word. The first year of my exile was not defined by a burning desire for revenge. It was defined by a hollow, crushing silence. I moved out of our beautiful Park Slope brownstone with nothing but 2 suitcases of clothes and a cardboard box of personal books. Because I had signed the at-fault divorce papers under extreme duress, I was legally stripped of any claim to our joint assets. My bank accounts were frozen and then systematically drained by Chloe's relentless legal maneuvering. I was left with a meager personal checking account that held just enough money to secure a lease on a decaying, 1-bedroom apartment in the deepest, most industrial edge of Sunset Park, Brooklyn. My new reality was a brutal shock to the system. The apartment smelled of damp plaster and decades of stale cigarette smoke. The heating was entirely theoretical. During the bitter winter months, the ancient iron radiator would simply hiss and spit rusty water without producing any actual warmth. I slept on a cheap mattress on the floor, wearing 2 layers of sweaters, staring up at the water stains on the ceiling, replaying the boardroom betrayal in my head until my mind felt bruised and bleeding. But the physical poverty was nothing compared to the absolute social annihilation Chloe had orchestrated. My sister wasn't just content with stealing my intellectual property and my husband. She knew that to truly secure her new empire, she had to destroy my credibility. If I ever tried to speak out, to claim that Apex Capital was built on stolen code, I needed to look like a desperate, vindictive liar. She executed a masterclass in character assassination. Using her influence and the fabricated embezzlement audit from my former employer, Chloe quietly poisoned the well. She spun a tragic, tear-filled narrative to our mutual friends, and worst of all, to our parents. She told them I had suffered a severe mental breakdown. She told them I had tried to steal millions from a charity to fund a gambling addiction, and that Mark had heroically covered it up to keep me out of federal prison. She claimed the divorce was a tragic necessity because I had become erratic and abusive. When I finally gathered the courage to call my mother, desperate for a lifeline, she answered with a cold, clipped tone. Chloe told us everything, Alara. We are so disappointed in you. You need to get psychiatric help before you call this house again. Click. The dial tone echoed in my freezing apartment. I was completely, utterly alone. I was a ghost haunting my own life. To survive, I took a low-level, soul-crushing job doing basic data entry for a regional logistics company. I spent my days inputting shipping manifests for minimum wage, hiding my advanced degrees and my history, terrified that Chloe's private investigators were still watching me. I ate instant noodles and cheap canned soup. I completely disappeared. And from the shadows of my exile, I watched them conquer the world. Mark and Chloe didn't just launch Apex Capital, they detonated it onto Wall Street like a financial nuclear bomb. Because Delphi's predictive algorithms were flawlessly accurate, the hedge fund's returns were staggering. While legacy firms celebrated a 10% annual yield, Apex was posting triple-digit returns quarter after quarter. They rebranded my beautiful, humanitarian oracle as the Apex quantitative engine. I would sit in the dark of my apartment, the blue light of a cracked, second-hand television illuminating my face, watching Mark grace the covers of Forbes, Bloomberg, and the Wall Street Journal. He was hailed as the next Warren Buffett, a generational genius who had cracked the code of the global economy. Chloe was always right there beside him, officially named as chief legal officer and co-founder, praised for her razor-sharp corporate instincts. Watching them use my code made me physically ill. I had built Delphi to predict droughts so international charities could preposition grain shipments and prevent famine. Mark and Chloe used Delphi to predict those exact same droughts, but instead of sending aid, they aggressively shorted agricultural futures, intentionally driving up the price of grain to make billions while entire regions starved. I had built a shield to protect the vulnerable, and they had forged it into a sword to slaughter them. The final, fatal blow to my heart came during my second year of exile. I was waiting for the subway, huddled in my worn winter coat, when I looked up at a digital billboard overlooking the platform. It was a lifestyle segment from a morning news show, featuring the billionaire wedding of the year. There, projected in high definition across a 20-foot screen, was my sister, wearing a custom Vera Wang gown, walking down the aisle of an exclusive private estate in the Hamptons. Waiting for her at the altar, wiping a theatrical tear from his eye, was Mark. They kissed as white dove confetti rained down around them. The chyron at the bottom of the screen read, Wall Street royalty, Apex Capital founders tie the knot. I stood on the grimy concrete platform as the train roared past, blowing freezing trash against my legs. I stared at the screen until it transitioned to a commercial for luxury watches. In that exact moment, the last lingering ounce of grief, the final, pathetic shred of love I had held onto for my husband and my sister, instantly evaporated. It didn't turn into sadness. It didn't even turn into rage. It crystallized. It compressed under the immense, crushing weight of their betrayal and turned into something infinitely harder, colder, and sharper. I walked back up the stairs and out of the subway station. I didn't go to my data entry job that day. I walked to a discount electronics store and spent the last of my meager savings on 3 cheap monitors, a refurbished server tower, and a mechanical keyboard. I hauled the equipment up the 3 flights of stairs to my apartment. I pushed the cheap mattress to the side and set up a workstation on the floor. I plugged everything in, the humming of the cooling fan sounding like the first breath of a new life. They thought I was a broken, defeated woman. They thought they had legally fortified their empire against any possible attack. Chloe's contracts were ironclad. Mark's financial firewalls were impenetrable. But I didn't need to breach their firewalls. I didn't need to hack their servers. I didn't need a lawyer, and I didn't need a boardroom. Because before they ever stole Delphi, before they ever realized what the algorithm was capable of, the Oracle had already foreseen a betrayal. I had built the weapon. And only I knew where the detonator was buried. To understand the weapon I had unknowingly built for my own revenge, you have to understand the fundamental architecture of Project Delphi. Most artificial intelligence models built for Wall Street are terrifyingly simple at their core. They are purely mathematical engines, designed with a single, brutal objective function: maximize profit. They look at historical data, identify patterns, and execute trades faster than humanly possible. They have no conscience, no context, and no capacity for ethical reasoning. They are digital sharks, swimming through an ocean of data, programmed only to eat. But I didn't build Delphi for Wall Street. I built her for the United Nations, for the Red Cross, and for global humanitarian coalitions. Because of that, Delphi was not a standard neural network. Beneath the billions of lines of predictive algorithms and real-time data scraping protocols, I engineered a foundational layer of code that I call the Moral Alignment Protocol. It was a weighted ethical matrix. Delphi was programmed to identify global supply chain bottlenecks specifically so that resources could be allocated to prevent human suffering. To achieve this, the AI had to fundamentally understand the difference between stabilizing a market and exploiting it. When Mark and Chloe stole the source code, they stole the entire architecture. Chloe's ruthless legal mind and Mark's banking experience allowed them to successfully rebrand the software as the Apex quantitative engine, but they were not software engineers. They were parasites feeding off a host they didn't understand. They brought in an army of Ivy League developers to build sleek trading interfaces, automated execution algorithms, and heavily encrypted biometric security walls around my core code. But not a single one of those highly paid Silicon Valley mercenaries dared to actually alter Delphi's foundational matrix. The neural network was too complex, a labyrinth of self-teaching code that shifted and evolved every millisecond. If they changed a single baseline parameter, the entire predictive model could collapse, taking their $10 billion golden goose with it. So, they did what arrogant tech executives always do: they built a shiny new house on top of a foundation they never bothered to inspect. If they had inspected it, they would have found the dead man's switch. When I was first developing Delphi in my Park Slope home office, I was paranoid. Not about my sweet, coffee-making husband, but about rogue nation states or corporate syndicates hacking my servers. If an entity with malicious intent gained control of a machine that could flawlessly predict global crop failures, they could weaponize it to intentionally starve entire populations for profit. To prevent this, I hard-coded a supreme failsafe directly into the moral alignment protocol. The failsafe requires a manual, cryptographic handshake. It is a highly specific, rotating 256-bit encryption key that must be injected into the root command line exactly once every 365 days. The key can only be generated by a specific hardware token, a custom flashed USB drive that I kept hidden inside the lining of my winter coat, which Chloe's lawyers didn't think to confiscate when they threw me out into the rain. If that 365-day timer hits zero without the handshake, Delphi executes its final, irreversible directive. It assumes the creators have been compromised, killed, or removed, and that the AI is now in the hands of hostile actors. It does not shut down. A sudden shutdown is too easily mitigated. Server administrators would simply hit the kill switch, freeze trading, and restore the system from a clean backup within an hour. Instead, the moral alignment protocol triggers a silent, systemic inversion. It takes the engine's flawless ability to predict the future and flips the mathematical sign from positive to negative. Delphi will still know exactly which stocks are going to soar and which commodities are going to crash, but it will actively, aggressively execute high-frequency trades in the exact opposite direction of profitability. If a tech stock is about to jump 20%, Delphi will short it with maximum leverage. If a pharmaceutical company is about to go bankrupt, Delphi will buy millions of shares at the peak price. And because Apex Capital utilizes algorithmic high-frequency trading, HFT executing thousands of microtransactions per second without human oversight, the inversion will bleed billions of dollars of capital before Mark or his engineers can physically press the emergency stop button. For the first 2 years of my exile, sitting in my freezing Brooklyn apartment, I quietly logged into a heavily spoofed virtual private network and injected the handshake. I kept Delphi alive. I kept the timer resetting. I watched Apex Capital grow from a boutique hedge fund into a massive, globally feared financial leviathan. I let Mark and Chloe get incredibly, obscenely rich. I let them buy the Hamptons estate, the fleet of supercars, and the fawning adoration of the financial press. I let them climb higher and higher, inflating their leverage and their egos until they touch the sun. Because the higher the pedestal, the more lethal the drop. Now, it is year 3. Tomorrow morning is the initial public offering. Apex Capital is going public, allowing retail investors and massive institutional pensions to buy shares in Mark and Chloe's stolen genius. The timer currently reads, time remaining, 1400 hours. 14 hours until the opening bell. 14 hours until the switch flips. I sit on the floor of my apartment, bathed in the blue light of my 3 refurbished monitors. On the left screen, my terminal window is open, the green countdown timer ticking away relentlessly in the dark. On the center screen, I have my newly opened brokerage account. Over the last 3 years, I've lived like a ghost. I walked 3 miles in the snow to save on subway fare. I ate bruised produce from the discount bins. I wore the same 2 sweaters until the elbows wore completely through. Every single penny I earned from my miserable data entry job was hoarded with a psychotic, single-minded focus. I have amassed exactly $22,400. It is my lifeblood. It is 3 years of starvation, humiliation, and freezing nights distilled into liquid capital. I move my mouse and begin executing my trades. I am not buying stock. I am buying deep out of the money put options on Apex Capital. A put option is a contract that gives me the right to sell a stock at a specific price, called the strike price. Apex is slated to open at $150 a share tomorrow morning. I am buying thousands of put contracts with a strike price of $20, expiring at the end of the week. To any rational Wall Street trader, this is pure financial suicide. It is a mathematical impossibility. It is a bet that a $10 billion titan will lose 85% of its value in a matter of hours. The option premiums are currently trading for pennies because the market algorithms consider them entirely worthless. I spend it all. Every last dollar. My account balance drops to $0. If Apex Capital survives tomorrow, those options will expire worthless. I will be bankrupt. I won't make rent next month. I will be homeless on the streets of New York. But if the Oracle does what she was designed to do, if the moral alignment protocol detonates and the algorithm eats the empire alive, my $22,400 will violently multiply into millions. I lean back against the cheap drywall, pulling my worn coat tighter around my shoulders. I listen to the hum of the cooling fans. I close my eyes and picture Mark's perfect, arrogant smile. I picture Chloe's pristine white wedding dress. Sleep well, my loves, I think to myself, the cold, hard satisfaction finally settling deep in my chest. Tomorrow, we balance the scales. The morning of the initial public offering dawned gray and bitterly cold over Sunset Park. Frost clung to the corners of my single, barred window, blurring the jagged skyline of Manhattan in the distance. I hadn't slept for a single second. I sat cross-legged on the floor in my oversized, threadbare sweater, clutching a mug of black coffee that had gone cold hours ago. My world was reduced to the 3 glowing monitors illuminating the peeling paint of my tiny apartment. On the left monitor, the green text of the terminal window pulsed with the rhythm of a digital heartbeat. Root access, denied. Moral alignment protocol, pending. Time remaining, 0:45. 45 minutes. On the right monitor, the live feed from CNBC was running without commercial interruption. The financial news networks were treating the Apex Capital IPO like the Super Bowl. The banners at the bottom of the screen flashed in aggressive, bold lettering, Apex Capital, APX, set to shatter records. The algorithm that conquered Wall Street. The camera cut to the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. The room was a sea of chaotic energy, packed shoulder to shoulder with traders, analysts, and journalists. And standing high above them all, on the iconic Bell podium, were the architects of my ruin. Mark looked like a modern emperor. He wore a custom-tailored suit that draped perfectly over his frame, projecting absolute, unshakable confidence. Chloe stood at his right hand, radiant in a structured, pristine white designer dress, her hair blown out into perfect waves. They were laughing together, whispering private jokes while the cameras flashed relentlessly, capturing their triumph for the front page of every financial paper on the planet. The anchor on the television feed was practically shouting over the roar of the trading floor. We are joined now, live from the podium, by Mark and Chloe Vance, the CEO and Chief Legal Officer of Apex Capital. The anchor beamed, holding an earpiece. Mark, the valuation this morning is staggering. $10 billion. Institutional investors are clawing over each other to get a piece of your proprietary algorithm. How does it feel to have built the ultimate financial weapon? Mark leaned into the microphone, his brilliant, practiced smile never wavering. It's a humbling day, Jim. But this wasn't an overnight success. Chloe and I built this architecture from the ground up, writing code in our home office, sacrificing our personal lives because we believed in the vision. The Apex engine isn't just a trading bot, it's a predictive ecosystem. We see the market before the market even knows what it's doing. I stared at the screen, my fingernails digging into the ceramic of my coffee mug until my knuckles turned white. Writing code in our home office, the sheer, psychopathic audacity of the lie was breathtaking. He had never written a single line of code in his entire life. He had stood over my shoulder, kissed the top of my head, and planned my execution. Chloe, the anchor pivoted, as co-founder and legal architect, what is the secret to Apex's flawless win rate? Chloe smiled warmly, the exact same smile she had used to frame me for federal crimes. It's relentless discipline, Jim. We don't rely on emotion. We rely on the math. The math is pure. The math never lies. I looked at the terminal on my left monitor. Time remaining, 0:15. She was right about one thing. The math never lies. And the math was about to collect its debt. At exactly 9:30 a.m. Eastern Standard Time, Mark Vance raised the wooden gavel high above his head. He brought it down with a resounding, amplified crack. The opening bell rang out, a sharp, metallic trill that echoed through the cavernous hall. Confetti rained down from the ceiling in a shower of gold and green. The trading floor erupted into a deafening roar of applause and shouting. Mark and Chloe embraced, kissing for the cameras, billionaires officially minted in the eyes of the global economy. On my center monitor, my brokerage account refreshed. The ticker symbol went live. APX, $150. APX, $175.50. APX, $210.20. The green line on the graph went completely vertical. The hype was so astronomical that the stock price surged 40% in the first 3 minutes of trading. The algorithms of other hedge funds and the frenzy of retail investors piled into the stock, terrified of missing out on the next great tech boom. Apex Capital was no longer worth $10 billion. In a matter of minutes, its market capitalization swelled to nearly $15 billion. Simultaneously, the value of my $22,400 in put options, my desperate bet that the stock would crash below $20, dropped to an absolute fraction of a penny. To the rest of the world, my portfolio was entirely, mathematically worthless. I was bankrupt. I didn't blink. I didn't breathe. I just watched the terminal window. Time remaining, 0 hours and 59 seconds. Time remaining, 0 hours and 10 seconds. Time remaining, 0 hours and 3 seconds. Come on, Delphi, I whispered into the freezing, empty room. Wake up. 0 o'clock. Handshake protocol, failed. Alignment status, compromised. Initiating inversion. The text on the terminal didn't flash red or sound an alarm. It simply blinked out, replaced by a steady, solid block of code cascading down the screen. The oracle had opened her eyes. She looked at her creators, saw they were missing, and assumed the system had been captured by the enemy. At Apex Capital's massive, heavily guarded server farm in New Jersey, the moral alignment protocol silently executed. It bypassed the sleek, expensive biometric firewalls Mark's engineers had built, because the protocol wasn't a virus breaking in. It was the foundation of the house shifting beneath their feet. High-frequency trading operates on a scale of milliseconds. Apex Capital executed roughly 50,000 microtransactions a second. For the first 2 minutes after the inversion, the catastrophe was completely invisible to the human eye. But I knew exactly what Delphi was doing. She looked at the global data. She saw that a major tech conglomerate was about to announce record-breaking quarterly profits. Yesterday, Delphi would have bought 1 million shares of that company. Today, she aggressively short-sold 2 million shares, betting against a guaranteed winner with maximum, highly leveraged margin. She saw a decaying, bankrupt retail chain that was scheduled to be delisted from the exchange by the end of the week. Delphi immediately diverted $2 billion of Apex's capital to buy the worthless stock at a premium. She was actively, ruthlessly burning money at the speed of light. On the right monitor, the CNBC broadcast was still celebrating. Mark was shaking hands with the president of the stock exchange. Chloe was holding a glass of champagne, laughing brilliantly. Then, in the background of the shot, a man in a dark suit, one of Mark's senior quantitative analysts, sprinted onto the balcony. He wasn't smiling. He was pale, sweating profusely, and frantically waving a glowing iPad. He shoved his way past a cameraman and grabbed Mark by the shoulder, physically spinning the newly minted billionaire around. The camera caught the exact moment the analyst shoved the iPad into Mark's chest. I watched Mark's perfect, arrogant smile freeze. I watched his eyes dart across the screen. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a wax corpse under the bright studio lights. The glass of champagne in Chloe's hand slipped from her fingers, shattering on the podium floor. On my center monitor, the APX stock ticker hesitated. It hovered at $215 for one agonizing second, and then, the rumors of the internal hemorrhage hit the trading floor. The ticker flashed red. The massacre had begun. Time remaining, 0 hours and 59 seconds. Time remaining, 0 hours and 10 seconds. Time remaining, 0 hours and 3 seconds. Come on, Delphi, I whispered into the freezing, empty room. Wake up. 0 o'clock. Handshake protocol, failed. Alignment status, compromised. Initiating inversion. The text on the terminal didn't flash red or sound an alarm. It simply blinked out, replaced by a steady, solid block of code cascading down the screen. The Oracle had opened her eyes. She looked at her creators, saw they were missing, and assumed the system had been captured by the enemy. At Apex Capital's massive, heavily guarded server farm in New Jersey, the moral alignment protocol silently executed. It bypassed the sleek, expensive biometric firewalls Mark's engineers had built, because the protocol wasn't a virus breaking in. It was the foundation of the house shifting beneath their feet. High-frequency trading operates on a scale of milliseconds. Apex Capital executed roughly 50,000 microtransactions a second. For the first 2 minutes after the inversion, the catastrophe was completely invisible to the human eye. But I knew exactly what Delphi was doing. She looked at the global data. She saw that a major tech conglomerate was about to announce record-breaking quarterly profits. Yesterday, Delphi would have bought 1 million shares of that company. Today, she aggressively short-sold 2 million shares, betting against a guaranteed winner with maximum, highly leveraged margin. She saw a decaying, bankrupt retail chain that was scheduled to be delisted from the exchange by the end of the week. Delphi immediately diverted $2 billion of Apex's capital to buy the worthless stock at a premium. She was actively, ruthlessly burning money at the speed of light. On the right monitor, the CNBC broadcast was still celebrating. Mark was shaking hands with the president of the stock exchange. Chloe was holding a glass of champagne, laughing brilliantly. Then, in the background of the shot, a man in a dark suit, one of Mark's senior quantitative analysts, sprinted onto the balcony. He wasn't smiling. He was pale, sweating profusely, and frantically waving a glowing iPad. He shoved his way past a cameraman and grabbed Mark by the shoulder, physically spinning the newly minted billionaire around. The camera caught the exact moment the analyst shoved the iPad into Mark's chest. I watched Mark's perfect, arrogant smile freeze. I watched his eyes dart across the screen. I watched the blood completely drain from his face, leaving him looking like a wax corpse under the bright studio lights. The glass of champagne in Chloe's hand slipped from her fingers, shattering on the podium floor. On my center monitor, the APX stock ticker hesitated. It hovered at $215 for one agonizing second, and then, the rumors of the internal hemorrhage hit the trading floor. The ticker flashed red. The massacre had begun. On my center monitor, the Apex Capital stock ticker, APX, began its historic, fatal plunge. The initial IPO hype had pushed it to $215 a share. As the massive trading losses began registering on public ledgers, the institutional investors panicked. They hit the sell button. APX, $180.50. APX, $145.20. APX, $98. The line on the graph dropped so violently it looked like a physical collapse. In less than 10 minutes, $10 billion of market capitalization evaporated into thin air. And as their empire burned, my freezing, dingy apartment in Brooklyn began to feel incredibly warm. I tabbed over to my brokerage account. The thousands of put options I had purchased with my entire life savings, my $22,400 bet that the stock would crash below $20, were no longer worthless. As the stock price plummeted toward my strike price, the intrinsic value of my options exploded exponentially. The account balance flickered, updated, and stabilized. Available funds, $845,000. I had made nearly $1 million in 10 minutes. I didn't cheer. I didn't smile. I took a slow, methodical sip of my cold black coffee. I wasn't going to sell. Not yet. The stock was at $98. I wanted it at zero. I wanted absolute, unmitigated ruin. Back on the television feed, the catastrophic reality was finally hitting the prime brokers. Apex Capital didn't just trade with its own money, it traded on margin, borrowing billions from Tier 1 banks like Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley to leverage its bets. As Delphi intentionally lost billions on inverted trades, those prime brokers triggered automated margin calls. Sirens were undoubtedly blaring in Mark's command center. The banks were demanding that Apex post billions of dollars in cash collateral immediately to cover their toxic positions. But Apex didn't have the cash. The algorithm had already tied it all up in failing assets. If they couldn't post the collateral, the banks would forcibly liquidate the entire hedge fund. It would be an extinction-level event. In the glass-walled VIP room on my screen, I watched Mark Vance physically collapse. His legs gave out, and he sank into a leather chair, burying his face in his hands. He was a billionaire at 9:30 a.m. By 9:45 a.m., he was mathematically insolvent. Chloe was standing over him, screaming, her perfect hair unraveled, the composed corporate lawyer entirely replaced by a desperate, cornered animal. She pointed at the laptop, then grabbed Mark by the collar of his bespoke suit, shaking him. Even without audio, I could read her lips perfectly. Call her. They finally understood. The Ivy League engineers were useless. The biometric firewalls were useless. There was only one person on the planet who understood the architecture of the Oracle well enough to stop the inversion. On my cheap laminate desk, my cell phone suddenly lit up, vibrating violently against the wood. The caller ID flashed in bright, desperate letters, Mark Vance. I let it ring. The cheap, cracked plastic of my cell phone vibrated violently against the laminate desk, slowly rotating in circles as it rang. Mark Vance. I sat cross-legged on the floor of my freezing Sunset Park apartment, watching the phone spin. On the right monitor, the CNBC broadcast showed Mark in the glass-walled VIP suite above the trading floor. He had the phone pressed so hard against his ear his knuckles were white. Chloe was pacing behind him like a caged, rabid animal, her pristine white wedding dress ruined, stained with sweat and spilled champagne. I let it ring 4 times. I wanted them to stew in the absolute, terrifying silence of their impending ruin. I wanted them to feel a fraction of the isolation I had felt when they locked me out of my own life. On the 5th ring, I picked it up and tapped the speakerphone button. "Hello, Mark," I said. My voice wasn't shaking. It was entirely, beautifully calm. It was the voice of a woman who had already mourned the dead and was now just tending to the graves. "Alara." Mark's voice was a breathless, high-pitched gasp. Gone was the smooth, baritone confidence of the billionaire CEO. He sounded like a man drowning. "Alara, thank God. You have to fix this. Right now. You have to log into the administrative portal and initiate a hard override. The code is glitching. It's executing massive, completely irrational block trades. It's shorting Apple and buying bankrupt shell companies." "It isn't glitching, Mark," I said, taking a slow sip of my cold coffee. "Delphi is executing her programming flawlessly. She has a 99.8% confidence interval, remember?" "What are you talking about?" Chloe's voice shrieked in the background. She must have ripped the phone out of Mark's hand. "Alara, you vindictive bitch, what did you do to the algorithm? The prime brokers are issuing margin calls. Goldman Sachs just demanded $3 billion in cash collateral that we don't have. Turn it off." "I can't turn it off, Chloe," I replied smoothly. "And neither can your expensive Ivy League engineers, because you were too terrified to let them audit the core architecture. You built a $10 billion house on a foundation you didn't understand." "Explain it to me," Mark begged, his voice returning to the line, layered with a desperate, pathetic whine. It was the exact tone he used to use when he wanted me to do his laundry. "Please, Alara. We're family. Just tell me what's happening." "It's called the Moral Alignment Protocol," I said, leaning back against the cold drywall. "I built Delphi to be a humanitarian tool. She was designed to stabilize markets, not exploit them. I hard-coded a dead man switch deep inside her neural network. It requires a 256-bit cryptographic handshake from my personal terminal once a year. If she doesn't get it, she assumes her creators have been compromised by hostile actors. Like, for instance, a greedy banker and a corrupt lawyer." Silence hung on the line for 3 agonizing seconds, broken only by the chaotic, muffled screaming from the trading floor below them. "So give us the key," Chloe yelled, the corporate lawyer in her desperately trying to claw back control. "We will wire you $10 million right now, Alara. We'll set up an offshore trust. Just send the cryptographic file to our lead engineer. If Apex goes insolvent, you get nothing. Don't be an idiot." I looked at my center monitor. The APX stock ticker was in absolute freefall. The market had completely turned on them. APX, $65.40. APX, $42.10. APX, $38. 10 million? I let out a dry, hollow laugh that echoed in the empty apartment. "Your fund was valued at $15 billion 20 minutes ago, Chloe. You think my soul is on discount?" "50 million. Mark screamed, pure panic tearing at his vocal cords. "Alara, I swear to God, I will give you $50 million and a board seat. We can fix this. We can be a team again. I'm sorry, okay? I'm so sorry we hurt you. We just got caught up in the ambition, but I never stopped caring about you." Hearing him attempt to weaponize our dead marriage was the final validation I needed. There was no remorse in his voice, only the terror of a parasite being ripped from its host. "You didn't get caught up in ambition, Mark," I said coldly. "You fabricated a federal audit to frame me for embezzlement. You stole my life's work. You left me to freeze in a slum while you bought a mansion in the Hamptons with your new wife. You didn't make a mistake. You made a calculation." "Alara, please," Mark sobbed. He was actually crying. The great Wall Street titan was weeping on live television, safely hidden behind a glass wall that the world's cameras were currently zoomed in on. "Goldman Sachs is going to force liquidate our entire portfolio in 4 minutes. We will owe them billions personally. They will take the houses. They will take everything." "There is only one way I stop the inversion," I said, my voice dropping to a terrifyingly quiet whisper. "Anything," Chloe gasped. "Name it." "Walk out of that VIP suite," I commanded. "Walk back down to the Bell podium. Look directly into the CNBC cameras, and confess. Tell the world that you stole Project Delphi. Tell them you framed me for wire fraud. Confess to the SEC, the DOJ, and the entire financial sector that Apex Capital is a fraudulent, stolen entity." "We can't do that," Chloe screamed, her legal instincts short-circuiting. "That's an admission of massive corporate fraud. We'd go to federal prison for 20 years. "Then I guess you better hope Goldman Sachs is feeling merciful today," I whispered. "Wait. Don't hang up," Mark pleaded. "The Oracle has spoken, Mark. The math never lies." I pressed the red button, ending the call. I didn't just hang up, I powered the phone down completely and tossed it onto the mattress. I turned my full attention to the center monitor. The Apex Capital stock had finally breached my strike price. APX, $19.50. APX, $12. APX, $8.40. It was a bloodbath. My brokerage account balance was a blur of updating digits, the value of my put options compounding with every penny the stock dropped. Available funds, $4,250,000. Available funds, $7,800,000. I had nearly $8 million in liquid capital. The stock was plunging toward penny stock territory. I didn't wait for it to hit zero. Greed is what killed Mark and Chloe. I was a creature of precision. I moved my mouse, highlighted my entire portfolio of put options, and clicked sell to close. The order routed through the exchange. It executed instantly, bought up by the desperately scrambling automated market makers trying to cover the massive volatility. Cash balance, $8,142,500. The money was real. It was cleared. I was a multimillionaire, sitting in a freezing apartment in Sunset Park. On the right monitor, the CNBC broadcast suddenly cut to a breaking news graphic, accompanied by a blaring emergency klaxon. The anchor was holding a sheet of paper, his face pale. Breaking news from the New York Stock Exchange, he said, his voice grave. Trading on Apex Capital has been officially halted. We are receiving confirmation from multiple prime brokers, including Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, that Apex Capital has failed to meet emergency margin calls. The banks have initiated a forced, total liquidation of the fund's assets. The camera cut back to the VIP room above the floor. Mark Vance was on his knees, his hands flat against the glass, staring down at the ruined empire below him. Chloe was curled in a corner, her face buried in her knees. They were gone. The billion-dollar mirage had evaporated, leaving nothing but the crippling, astronomical debt they owed to the most ruthless banks on earth. The financial collapse of a $10 billion hedge fund does not happen in slow motion. When the math turns terminal, the execution is instantaneous, brutal, and entirely televised. I sat on the floor of my freezing apartment in Sunset Park, the blue light of the monitors washing over my face, and watched the funeral of Apex Capital broadcast live to the entire world. The CNBC anchors were practically breathless, their voices raised an octave as they tried to narrate the unprecedented carnage unfolding on the floor of the New York Stock Exchange. We are getting unprecedented reports from our sources at Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley, the lead anchor said, pressing his hand against his earpiece, his face grave. The prime brokers have officially declared Apex Capital to be in catastrophic default. The fund's algorithmic engine initiated thousands of massive, highly leveraged, and completely irrational trades in the opening minutes of the IPO. Because Apex utilizes a 100-to-1 margin ratio, these losses didn't just wipe out their cash reserves, they plunged the fund into billions of dollars of negative equity. The banks are seizing everything. On my right monitor, the camera feed remained locked on the glass-walled VIP suite hovering above the trading floor. The door to the suite burst open. It wasn't paramedics or exchange officials rushing in. It was a swarm of men and women wearing stark navy blue windbreakers with bold, yellow lettering on the back, SEC enforcement and FBI. The federal government had been monitoring the catastrophic market anomalies, terrified that Delphi's rogue trading was a coordinated cyber attack by a foreign state meant to destabilize the American economy. They weren't taking chances. I watched as 3 federal agents immediately surrounded Mark. He was still kneeling on the floor, staring blankly at the glass. When an agent grabbed his shoulder, Mark flinched as if he had been struck with a live wire. He stood up, his bespoke Tom Ford suit hanging loosely on his frame, the posture of the arrogant billionaire completely shattered. They didn't put him in handcuffs, not yet, but they physically boxed him in, confiscating his phone and forcing him toward the door. Chloe was fighting back. Even in her ruined, champagne-stained white designer dress, the corporate lawyer in her was desperately clawing for survival. She was pointing fingers, shouting at the federal agents, demanding her right to counsel, trying to assert some kind of legal dominance. An FBI agent simply stared at her, unimpressed by her pedigree, and pointed sternly toward the exit. She grabbed her leather briefcase, but an agent immediately snatched it from her hand, tagging it as federal evidence. The golden couple of Wall Street was escorted out of the VIP room, marched through the chaotic, screaming trading floor, and paraded out the back doors of the exchange under the blinding flashes of hundreds of paparazzi cameras. It was the ultimate, inescapable perp walk. They were financially annihilated. I knew the specific corporate structure of Apex Capital because Chloe had been foolish enough to brag about it in interviews. To secure the massive billions in margin loans required for high-frequency trading, Mark and Chloe hadn't just put up the fund's assets as collateral. In their boundless, arrogant certainty that Delphi could never fail, they had signed personal guarantees. That meant the prime brokers weren't just going to seize the servers and the office furniture. Goldman Sachs was coming for the Hamptons estate. They were coming for the fleet of imported supercars. They were coming for the private jet, the offshore bank accounts, and the expensive watches. Mark and Chloe were going to be stripped down to the absolute studs. They would be left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and the impending, crushing weight of a federal criminal indictment. I turned away from the television. The show was over. It was time for me to move. I looked at my center monitor. The cash balance in my brokerage account sat proudly in bold, green text, $8,142,500. I initiated an immediate wire transfer, moving the entire $8 million out of the brokerage platform and into a secure, heavily encrypted private banking account I had quietly opened weeks ago. The screen buffered for 3 agonizing seconds before flashing a confirmation code. Transfer complete. Current balance, $0. The money was safe. I took a deep breath, the frigid air of the Sunset Park apartment filling my lungs. For 3 years, this damp, miserable room had been my prison cell. It was the place where I had starved, where I had frozen, and where I had meticulously sharpened the blade of my revenge. I didn't pack anything. I didn't want the threadbare sweaters, the cheap mattress, or the instant noodles. I didn't even want the refurbished monitors or the server tower. They were artifacts of a dead woman. The only thing I took was the small, encrypted USB drive, the hardware token that held the cryptographic handshake for the moral alignment protocol. I slipped it into the inside pocket of my coat, zipped the coat up to my chin, and walked out the door. I didn't even bother to lock the deadbolt behind me. When I stepped out onto the Brooklyn sidewalk, the biting January wind whipped my hair across my face, but I didn't feel cold. For the first time in 36 months, I felt a deep, radiating, invincible warmth. I walked 2 blocks to the subway, rode it into Manhattan, and emerged in the heart of Midtown. I walked directly into the lobby of the Plaza Hotel. I approached the marble front desk, handed the concierge my new private banking debit card, and booked their premier penthouse suite for the next month. 30 minutes later, I was standing by a massive, floor-to-ceiling window overlooking Central Park, wearing a plush, heavy bathrobe, drinking a cup of room service tea that cost more than my weekly grocery budget used to be. I sat down at the mahogany desk in the suite, opened a pristine, complimentary notepad, and picked up the hotel phone. I dialed the number of the most ruthless, expensive, and feared corporate litigation firm in New York City. A firm that specialized in intellectual property theft and SEC whistleblowing. A receptionist answered on the first ring. Harrison, Sterling, and Vance. How may I direct your call? I need to speak to a senior managing partner, I said, my voice projecting a calm, absolute authority. I'm sorry, ma'am, but our partners require a scheduled consultation and a minimum retainer fee of $200,000, the receptionist said with practiced polite dismissal. My name is Alara, I replied smoothly. I have $8 million in liquid capital. I am the sole, original architect of the proprietary algorithm currently known as the Apex quantitative engine. And I would like to retain your firm to initiate an immediate whistleblower lawsuit with the Securities and Exchange Commission, reporting Mark and Chloe Vance for grand larceny, wire fraud, and the fabrication of corporate documents. There was a profound, stunned silence on the other end of the line. The entire city was currently watching Apex Capital burn to the ground on the news, and the arsonist had just called their front desk. Please hold, ma'am, the receptionist breathed. I am patching you through to the senior partner immediately. The war of the shadows was over. I had detonated the bomb from the basement, but now, it was time to step into the light. It was time to take my masterpiece back from the ashes. It took exactly 6 months for the United States justice system and the Wall Street banking syndicate to completely, systematically strip Mark and Chloe down to the bone. The fallout from the Apex Capital collapse was biblical. Because they had signed personal guarantees to secure their massive margin leverage, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley didn't just seize the corporate bank accounts. The banks foreclosed on the Hamptons estate, repossessed the Tribeca penthouse, and impounded the fleet of supercars. Mark's $20,000 Patek Philippe watch was auctioned off to pay a fraction of a percent of his legal fees. Their joint bank accounts were frozen by the SEC, leaving them relying on overworked public defenders to fight the sprawling, multi-agency federal indictments I had initiated. I didn't have to fight them in court. I let the federal government do it for me. Armed with the original timestamped compilation logs of Delphi's source code, my new, brutally expensive legal team handed the FBI an ironclad case for intellectual property theft, wire fraud, and perjury. But I didn't care about the criminal trial. I cared about case number 26 to 11420, in Re Apex Capital Management LLC. The bankruptcy auction. On a humid Tuesday morning in July, I walked into the federal bankruptcy court in Lower Manhattan. I wasn't wearing a damp sweater or cheap jeans. I wore a tailored, midnight blue Alexander McQueen suit, my hair perfectly styled, my posture radiating the absolute confidence of a woman who held $8 million in a private trust. I took a seat in the second row, flanked by 2 senior partners from Harrison, Sterling, and Vance. Mark and Chloe were sitting at the defense table near the front, flanked by a single, exhausted-looking court-appointed attorney. They looked physically diminished. The golden aura of the Wall Street power couple had entirely evaporated. Mark's suit was off the rack and visibly wrinkled, his hair was thinning, and his face was drawn and gray. Chloe, the once ruthless corporate shark, looked terrified. Her nails were bitten down to the quick, and she kept anxiously bouncing her leg under the table. They didn't look at each other. The stress of impending federal prison and absolute poverty had shattered their romance. There is no loyalty among thieves when the vault is empty and the sirens are blaring. The court-appointed trustee stood at the podium, droning through the liquidation of Apex Capital's physical assets. The ergonomic office chairs, the espresso machines from the break room, and the massive server racks in New Jersey were all sold off for pennies on the dollar to corporate liquidators. Then came the final item. Lot 42, the trustee announced, adjusting his glasses, the complete intellectual property portfolio of Apex Capital Management, including the patents, copyright, and absolute source code of the Apex quantitative engine. The courtroom was dead silent. The room was packed with venture capitalists and tech lawyers, but no one raised a paddle. To the rest of the financial world, the Apex engine was radioactive waste. It was a broken, psychotic algorithm that had intentionally incinerated $10 billion in 20 minutes. It was the digital equivalent of a cursed artifact. Opening bid is set at $500,000, the trustee said. Silence. Mark stared at the floor. Chloe closed her eyes, a tear leaking out from beneath her lashes. Their life's work, my life's work, was being treated like garbage. Do I have $500,000? The trustee asked, looking bored, preparing to pass the lot. I nodded to my lead attorney. He raised his gold pen. $500,000, my lawyer stated clearly. Every head in the room swiveled. The venture capitalists murmured in confusion, wondering who was foolish enough to buy the toxic coat. But when Mark and Chloe turned around and saw me sitting there in my McQueen suit, looking back at them with cold, diamond-hard serenity, the last fragments of their sanity broke. Going once, going twice, the trustee chanted. Sold to the bidder in the second row. I had my masterpiece back. And I bought it for less than 10% of what I had made crashing their stock. As the courtroom adjourned, I stood up and buttoned my jacket. I walked out into the wide, marble corridor, my lawyers trailing a few steps behind me. Before I could reach the heavy oak doors leading to the street, Mark and Chloe intercepted me. Alara, Mark choked out, his voice cracking. He looked at my expensive suit, then down at his own scuffed shoes. He looked completely broken. Please. I have nothing. I'm facing 20 years in federal lockup. You won. You got the code back. You have millions. Tell the SEC you made a mistake about the IP theft. Tell them we had a verbal agreement. Just give me my life back. I stopped and looked at the man I used to make coffee for. The man I used to love with my entire soul. I felt absolutely nothing. Before I could answer, Chloe shoved past him, her eyes wide, wild, and desperate. The corporate lawyer was making her final, pathetic plea deal. Alara, listen to me, my sister begged, grabbing my forearm. I can help you. I have the internal emails. I can prove Mark orchestrated the whole thing. I can prove he forced me to draft the hostile takeover documents. I'll testify against him at the criminal trial if you just drop the civil damages suit against me. Mark recoiled, staring at Chloe as if she had just stabbed him in the chest. Chloe, what the hell are you doing? We are in this together. I left my wife for you. You ruined my life. Chloe screamed back at him, her voice echoing off the marble walls. You dragged me into this. I was a respected attorney before you got greedy. I watched them tear each other to pieces right in front of me. The snake was finally eating its own tail. I gently, firmly peeled Chloe's fingers off the sleeve of my jacket. I don't need your testimony, Chloe, I said softly, my voice cutting through their screaming match like a scalpel. The SEC already has the forensic server logs. They have the timestamped code. They don't need a plea deal, and neither do I. I didn't come here to save you. I came here to buy my property back. I looked back and forth between them one last time. Enjoy prison. I hear they don't serve Dom Perignon. I turned my back on my ex-husband and my former sister, walking out the heavy oak doors and into the bright, blinding July sunlight. I didn't look back. I never looked back at them again. A month later, unable to afford a trial and facing insurmountable federal evidence, Mark and Chloe Vance both pled guilty to multiple counts of securities fraud, wire fraud, and grand larceny. They each received 14 years in a federal penitentiary. The financial press called it the greatest hubris in modern Wall Street history. As for me, I didn't return to Sunset Park. I bought a sprawling, beautiful penthouse overlooking Central Park, but I didn't use it to throw lavish parties. I used it as a sanctuary. I spent the next year systematically stripping the bloated, parasitic Wall Street code off the core architecture of the moral alignment protocol. I purged the high-frequency trading algorithms, the margin leverage commands, and the greed. I restored Delphi to exactly what she was always meant to be. Today, I run the Delphi Foundation, a fully funded nonprofit tech conglomerate. I sit in a sunlit corner office, watching the beautiful, cascading data on my monitors. Delphi is currently coordinating with the World Health Organization, accurately predicting a massive logistical bottleneck in a South American medical supply chain. Because of her warning, cargo planes are already being rerouted, ensuring that millions of vaccines reach their destination before the crisis even begins. She isn't making me a billionaire anymore. But she is saving the world. I took a sip of my warm, perfect Earl Grey tea, looking out at the sprawling green expanse of the city below me. My family tried to bury me in the dark. They forgot that I was a creator. And a creator always knows how to build a fire.